Okay, so welcome everyone. It's been a while. It's been quite a while since I've done a online webinar on planning matters. And so I hope you find this very interesting. Tonight's subject is very topical, considering everything that is going on. We're looking at the future of planning, key changes from the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act to the present and going through Parliament at the moment, Planning and Infrastructure Bill 2025. All very topical, all very interesting, and I hope you get something out of it. Now, it wouldn't be a free webinar without me just showing off who we are and what we do, so I'm going to do that. So just forgive me, especially if you're a colleague from local authority. Turn off for this bit, you don't need to see it. So, town planning expert, established in 2012, we're known as the general practitioners of the planning world. We cover England. There are 2 chartered town planners in practice, which makes us a chartered planning practice. We also run TPX Academy, which is a CPD training organisation. We're a developer in our own right through Tricerno. We're up to 3,500 projects we've assisted on. We've got a 90% success rate in all modes. We produced the Victory Plan, which is a 1-day course on planning matters. We produced the Victory Plan, a practical approach to getting planning permission, which is a book that you can go and buy. And we're presently writing our second magnum opus, which is called the HMO Manual. At the moment, I'm about 10,000 words, which is an undergraduate dissertation in to writing the HMO Manual. This is what we can offer you when it comes to being part of your team in the game. I like to use football as an analogy or sport as an analogy to planning matters. And so I've lined us up as a traditional 4-4-2. So we offer advice through triage or private pre-app. We offer application services through permitted development, prior approval and planning applications. We help you discharge planning conditions. We do amendments to planning applications. We run planning appeals. I'm currently engaged in 2 enforcement matters at the moment, which is all very fun. We have our academy, and of course we do development too. That's just a broad brush of what we are and what we do. As for me, 23 years experience. I am a chartered town planner. I'm a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. I'm an accredited CPD trainer. I'm a planner first. 40 is an understatement, is pretty much 50 now. Cases on the boil at the same time. I teach planning. We do a little bit of development, or I do a little bit of development. I'm a published author and I write for YPN on a quarterly basis. They've just reminded me I have to write another one for the December issue, which is very nice of them. So, our man Steve. Steve Reed is the new Secretary of State. He's been in post for about a month, and he's been saying quite a lot recently. In the last 30 days, we've seen a lot coming out of his office, a lot coming out from him in terms of how he's going to make planning work better. So he's been talking about a pro-growth package through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill to slash planning delays and accelerate the building of homes and clean energy projects. We'll come on to that in a bit. He's proposing new powers for himself to overrule councils that reject planning permissions and tackle legal blockages that stall approved schemes. Nice, Steve. No detail on that yet. This is just what he's saying in the last 30 days. There has been the announcement of the London Emergency Deal. The London Emergency Deal is focused on getting London building again. The Mayor of London has finally admitted that they probably overcooked it, and we've got an emergency package to fast-track housing, a temporary reduction of the affordable housing requirement from 35% basic to 20% basic, and fast-tracking specific planning routes. They're talking about infrastructure streamlining. Now, a lot of the planning and infrastructure bill is about infrastructure streamlining, and they are opening a consultation to further amend that and make it easier and quicker to deliver nationally significant infrastructure projects. Basically, this government has got bored of major projects being stalled. We're going to touch upon that as we go through. Keir Starmer's all about AI. He's almost Mr. AI. I don't know if there are any Labour fans in the audience tonight. I'm going to insult your man. I'm pretty sure all of his speeches at the moment are written by ChatGPT. That all being said, he wants Britain to be an AI hub. And so they're bringing forward new legislation at the moment to ease the construction of large-scale AI data centers because AWS going down wasn't enough for them. There is current proposals in place and more inside the planning and infrastructure bill itself to allow local plans to become more flexible, to allow the inspectorate to become more flexible, less rigid when assessing local plans. And there are other really scary bits inside of that when it comes to Steve and his powers. I'm really sorry, I cannot say his name without overemphasizing the E. I don't know where it comes from, but it just happens. And then we've got this net zero focus. This government is obsessed with net zero at the moment, through one reason or another. And rightly or wrongly, it's something that we all have to face when it comes to development in England and in the UK right now. They have reaffirmed this 2030 commitment. Whether or not they get there or not is another matter altogether, but they've reaffirmed this commitment. So let's look at the legal framework. How is this all being pieced together? So we have in place the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, the LURA. This was the primary piece of legislation that was brought in through Royal Assent in 2023 that introduces powers for the Secretary of State to make wide-ranging changes to the planning system itself. Without the LURA, he couldn't be doing what he's doing today. We then have the brand new, well, I say brand new, December 2024, and then subtly changed in 2025 to correct some spelling errors. And it was actually to correct some spelling errors. We have the subtly changed framework, the MPPF. This document sets out how some of these new powers are going to be applied in practice for day-to-day planning. It is the core of the government's planning policy thrust for England. Wales has its own, Scotland has its own, Northern Ireland has a slightly weird version, but for England it's the MPPF. The core aim of the reforms is to speed up the system, deliver more high quality homes, cut bureaucracy and enhance environmental outcomes. And the Planning and Infrastructure Bill 2025 builds on this by providing the tools necessary in order to allow local authorities to do this and to provide enhanced certainty. Now that's good for developers and planning authorities. It's good for both sides. What we hope is we'll start to see the tinkering that has been going on in the system slow down, because the more you tinker with the system, the more everyone has to learn the new rules. So we're hoping this also allows the tinkering to slow down a bit. Let's look at some of these key changes. The government is consulting right now on the National Development Management Policies, the NDMPs. Now, what is a National Development Management Policy? It is exactly what it says. So the whole point of having an England-wide NDMP is to take the duplication out of local plans. So, for example, any planning authority that's got a green belt, we've got all of the authorities surrounding London, Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, I could go on. There are 13 of them in the country. They all have a policy that duplicates each other. So they all have a policy that duplicates appropriateness of development in the Greenbelt. The whole point of an NDMP would be to replace those duplicated policies with one policy. It's almost like the one ring to rule them all from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. You would also see the same for heritage. You'd see the same for highway safety. You'd see the same for any policy point which is duplicated across multiple authority areas, where there doesn't need to be local interpretation of the same words. What the NDMP provisions install is called the key conflict rule. The key conflict rule overrides the current hierarchy in the plan-led system. So at the moment, the national framework and the local plan sit side by side. You have to comply with both. And they, in theory, have to be compatible with each other. For the first time, if a local plan conflicts with the National Development Management Plan, the National Development Management Plan will automatically override the local plan at whatever stage the local plan is in. Now that significantly twists the plan-led system to a more central organized system, a more centrist system rather than localism. It's a rollback of the localism agenda. Central defining rather than local. In terms of national infrastructure, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill focuses heavily on getting the biggest projects in Britain moving fastest. So it does this in two ways. Firstly, they're trying to focus on faster decision making. At the moment, NSIPs take years. They can take years. So by speeding up the regime through targeted interventions like mandatory national updates to national policy statements and streamlining the pre-application consultation requirements for these major infrastructure projects, they hope to smooth the bumps when it comes to actually making those decisions. The other side of that coin is what happens when you approve a nationally significant infrastructure project. There is a period where interested people, third parties, statutory consultees, anyone with the wherewithal and the financial backing can engage a judicial review. Now they do this to stop the project occurring. That's the purpose of the judicial review, is to have the decision sent back to the Secretary of State and have it done again. By reducing the opportunity for that review, where cases are deemed without merit, so where they're vexatious cases, they're reducing the possibility of a judicial review, slowing things down. And then secondly, they're removing the disincentive of statutory consultees to engage proactively early in the process. At the moment, stat consultees aren't rewarded for that engagement. There's now provision in place that the project will pay for that engagement. So there is a surcharge that will be applied to the planning fee for an NSIP. All very small, all very big stuff for very small developers, but part of the government's agenda. Local plans. It is sad to say that there are some authorities out there in the world that are still sitting on incredibly dated local plans. And when I say incredibly dated, I mean some authorities are sitting on 1997 local plans. One authority is sitting on a 1995 local plan at the moment, is on its third attempt to try and get a local plan in place. So we're dealing with some incredibly old local plans. My old authority at Portsmouth is sitting on the 2012 city plan, right? That's what it's currently sitting on. The government proposes to change that by a mandatory 30 months time frame for production of a local plan. Now, having the National Development Management Policies, the NDMP, will make this easier because local plans will be slimmer and will not be permitted to repeat anything that's a national policy. So in theory, you'll have much slimmer, much simpler, much more focused local plans. They'll also be more visual. I don't know any of the developers in the room. We often see a local plan come forward where you look at the PDF version, you look at the proposals map, and you just wish that authority. I do apologize for the background noise. It's fireworks week and someone's decided to let a few off. You wish that that authority had a digital version of that plan that you could zoom in on and explore and work through, and some authorities just don't. I was looking at King's Lynn's local plan the other day, and they still have a proposals map that's not digitized. It's very difficult to work through. So plans will be more visual, map-based, and built on standardized digital data. Councils will not be expected to go over the data themselves. They will just put it into a standard system. New supplementary plans will be introduced to replace the existing suite of SPDs, supplementary planning documents, raising the status of an SPD up to that sits alongside a local plan. And this will enable councils to deal with very specific issues. For example, some councils have an SPD relating to HMOs, which has at the moment the status of guidance. That will be brought up to the status of policy. In terms of housing and environment specifically, there have been some major changes that have occurred and that developers are now taking heavy advantage of. The first is the restoration of the national mandatory target. Let me explain this. In the last days of the Tory government, the presumption in favour of sustainable development, the requirement to have a 5-year housing land supply, had been eroded down to a point where it was kind of a nice to have rather than anything that carried great weight. Most inspectors were able to just wave it away because it didn't carry enough weight behind it. When the Labour government came in, one of the first things they did through the NPPF is restore the presumption back to its status as primacy. So we now have a presumption in favour of sustainable development that carries significant weight, with the ongoing requirement that councils must have a rolling 5-year housing land supply. In addition to that, the government restored the standard method. Councils up and down the country were permitted to come up with their own method if they disagreed with the standard method in order to demonstrate their housing land supply. And what's happened is everyone's been restored back to a standard method. In addition to that, councils up and down the country had their housing calculation redone, with a number of them, about 60%, having their housing increased. In fact, the great exception to that was London, which took a 10,000 unit decrease across the entire city. Right? London was the big exception to the rule. The impact of this is where previously they were relaxed and made advisory, they're all mandatory again. And councils are now fighting to find their housing land supply, and latterly developers are taking advantage of the presumption in favour of sustainable development where it applies. We are seeing appeal decisions, the biggest one in Wokingham, nearly 600 units or thereabouts, with a 1.8 year housing land supply being recorded by the inspector at point of appeal. So there are some very big wins going on for people. I have a scheme currently in Wokingham, 2 units, where the planning officer is saying to me, every little helps. They're effectively saying, as many units as you can give me, but 1 or 2 now counts for us because our supply is so low. The other big change is grey belt. So grey belt fundamentally altered our general understanding of green belt. It was, I like to think of it as a soundbite that became policy. I'm sure there was more thought behind it than a soundbite that became policy. But what it is doing today is releasing greenbelt land. And there are now appeals out in the wild where the inspector is supporting the grey belt concept. It does play common sense. There are certain parts of the green belt that you look at and go, this really should be done. There is logic behind the madness. So actually doing this makes sense. Now there are the golden rules, the trade-offs. The catch, if you will, to development in the green belt or in the grey belt. If you have a major development, 10 units or more on released green belt land, including the grey belt, that must be subject to the strict golden rules. These mandate a significant proportion, up to 50% affordable on that site. So if you're doing 10 units and the local plan policy is written in a certain way, the maximum is 50. The rule actually is that it's 15% above the prevailing figure up to the maximum of 50. So if you take Bracknell Forest, for example, their affordable housing requirement's 35%. 35% plus 15 is a 50% requirement if you're doing grey belt development in Bracknell Forest. Support, provide provision for necessary infrastructure, schools, GP surgeries and transport, either through Section 106 or through Section 278 or through direct provision on the land. And improvements to genuine green spaces and ensuring development is on brownfield first. So going to the grey belt first before you then stretch into the green. Those are the golden rules. We move on to environmental outcome reports and nature recovery, or importantly, the Nature Restoration Fund. These are both legislated for now inside the inside the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. So the current system of environmental impact assessment will be replaced by an environmental outcome report instead. This shifts the focus from process to outcome. On an EIA, you're all about process, the how, whereas in an outcome report, you're looking at the end goal. Assessments are measured against a new environmental target, and they're designed to be clearer, shorter, and more effective. They're also looking at end, and so can be pushed further down the planning process. To go alongside this, the government, and it's very timely that we're talking about a possible new land tax with Rachel from Accounts seeking to tell us all about the wonderful taxes that she's going to bring in. But we are going to talk about a lovely new land tax. The Nature Restoration Fund levy is effectively a community infrastructure levy for nature restoration designed specifically to discharge environmental obligations on sites. What this effectively would do is for the right size site, smaller site, allow the developer to pay some money rather than doing direct action on their own site. It's proposed to deal with biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, water neutrality, and all of the other good stuff. If you had a protected species, for example, on your land, like very much they do in Holland and Denmark, you would pay money rather than get very stressed about whether or not you had a dormouse or a microscopic snail. The whole point of the Nature Restoration Fund is to place those finances in the hands of Natural England. who will then, on our behalf, go and make lovely areas for nature to do what nature does. Very achievable, considering that, depending on who you believe, between 5 and 8% of the UK is presently developed. It's actually quite a small figure. So quite achievable for Natural England to do, and an interesting way for the government to offset effects from development, effectively kicking it down the line and just saying, pay us some money and we'll make the problem go away. Digital first planning. Us consultants out in the world have been screaming about this for years. There are 4 major digital planning providers in the wild, from iDocs all the way through to Accolade. They display the data in completely different ways with completely different search parameters. In addition to that, councils are allowed to build their own systems. Bedford has, up until recently, used its own rather interesting way of displaying planning data. And in the London Borough of Hillingdon, you can't actually get to records unless you've got the planning reference number. It's behind a big blocker. So what the government is proposing through Digital First is to standardize how all this works, to create a single standard for planning data, one system to rule them all, again, centrally identified, with a streamlined and uniform. Now, I'm not using that term to suggest which one I think it's going to be, but they do run 70% of the authorities in the country, so it would be a bit obvious. A single uniform digital platform for the display of all planning data, with a uniform way of allowing the public to understand and comment on proposals online through interactive mapping and that single streamlined data set. Effectively everything happening through the council's own portal, not having to send emails, send letters, do this, do that, do the other. All with one system. Now, the benefits for having one system in England means that whenever you go onto any planning portal, the searching is all going to be the same. The display is all going to be the same. Everything's going to look the same. All the data is going to be in one place and where you expect it. So us consultants have been screaming for this for a while, and we've been hoping that the market just does its thing. Hopefully what we'll end up getting to is this happening? And there is a timeline for this, but hey, it's Britain, subject to slippage. There are some other notable changes that I want to draw upon, and then we're going to talk about some scary stuff. So we've got spatial development strategies. Now, this introduces strategic planning at a sub-regional level to deal with housing need and infrastructure across boundaries, replacing the duty to cooperate. Now, this is more pertinent when you think about what's going on with local government reform. We've just had the announcement for Surrey. The counties in Surrey are going to be split, east and west. We're going to have an east side of Surrey and a west side of Surrey. And I guess there'll be some gangland war somewhere around Dorking. The reality is that those authorities are going to have to cooperate because Surrey County Council will cease to exist. And so the spatial development strategy is a lever to allow that to happen. Probably the biggest thing that I think everyone has been asking for over a number of years is committee reform. At the moment, planning committee members are not required to be trained in planning. Often they will get 30 minutes, nothing more, on what is planning, what you're doing here, and what you're allowed to do. And they're asked to make multi-million-pound decisions. So a big development project could be worth £500 million. And a committee is asked to sit and determine the outcome for that project. What they're suggesting through the infrastructure bill and has made it through to the final stages of the bill is a new national delegation rulebook. That will mean that individual councils will not be allowed to decide what does and does not go to committee. It will be set nationally. And mandatory training for councillors making planning decisions to improve consistency and effectiveness. And that mandatory training will go so far as requiring members to complete a training course and have a certificate of completion, that course provided by central government providers, not by the council, before they are allowed to make decisions on planning applications. So they must go through this mandatory process. Stronger enforcement, we are now starting to see the upshot of this. The time limit for enforcement action changed in 2023. 6th of December 2023 is when the 4-year rule became the 10-year rule. And in so doing, we are effectively now on a clock. If your breach of planning control occurred before the 6th of December 2023, then you're still on the 4-year rule. If you created a house after, you're on a 10-year rule. It is the case that we're now whittling down the number of cases that are pre-2023, and there will be a point where just everything now is on the 10-year. Statutory design codes. Again, something that we as consultants have been screaming about for years. Design codes where they are used are excellent. And they're excellent because they set very firm criteria as to what the council will and will not accept from a design point of view. Lambeth, for example, has got an excellent design code with some very, very surprising provisions inside of it. And we are able to use that to hang the council with where we need to. What it does is provide certainty. There will be this new requirement for all local plans to include area-wide design codes to ensure that high quality design is reinforced through the code. Now that will be defined locally rather than nationally. So local authorities will be able to define their way of doing things, but once imposed, the local authority will be expected to stick to it. And so it will become that double-edged sword. If you just choose to deviate from the code, then you're going to have a good justification for it. If the council choose to deviate, then as a developer, you can use the code to reinforce that need to be consistent with it. In terms of the mandatory training, I just wanted to reflect upon that a little bit more. It's not perfect, but it's possibly better. This requirement is introduced through clause 45. The precise detail and content of the training is not set. So we don't know exactly what's going to go in. And it defers powers to Steve to make those regulations that will define the specifics. So in reality, what we're expecting is that the bill goes through and then a whole slew of secondary legislation comes out, and Steve has the opportunity. He's only been in the job for a couple of months, remember, so now an expert on planning. He's given the opportunity to say, or his team is given the opportunity to say, what is going to go into this training and what's not. It will be mandatory. It will apply to members of local planning authorities, those councillors who are involved in the decision-making process. The Secretary of State will have the power to mandate, accredit and set the standard. Now, the accredit bit is really important because there is training out there that is non-accredited and there is training out there that is accredited. And having the accredited component means that it has to go through a quality assurance process. The consequence of all this is just as I said, councillors will be prohibited from taking planning decisions if they've not completed the training and hold a valid certificate of completion. Think of it as a driving licence for planning committee. You can't jump in a car and drive a car without a driving licence. Planning committee members will not be able to sit on and make decisions unless they have completed their planning driving licence, completed this training and got the certificate to prove it. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than the current state of play. Now, the bill hasn't been easy, not by a long stroke. I call this slide shots fired, bullets dodged. The Lords have had their fun, and I thought I'd just highlight some of the more wacky ideas that have come out from our noble lords. So in terms of some of the positive ones, perhaps, there was a suggestion of a blanket ban on land banking. There was a suggestion of putting a blanket ban on new housing within very high flood risk zones. They actually use the term floodplains. I can see the logic there. Houses don't float, and if you're trying to build houses where it floods every year, that's probably a bad idea. They were suggesting mandatory design features where dwellings are permitted in a flood risk zone of low or moderate risk. Now, those design features they proposed were design features that I recommend when I'm writing flood risk assessments. So actually, I could fall in line with that. Some of the more wacky ideas that we're very pleased didn't make it into the final cut are the removal of all of the prior approval permitted development rights in Part 3. That's G, M, MA, N, and Q. Blanketly, happily, that didn't make the cut. So don't panic, don't worry. Our government isn't that stupid. That did not make its way in. A blanket ban on hotels and HMOs being used to house asylum seekers without the need of planning permission has been mooted and suggested by the noble lords. That again has not made its way into the final bill that is currently being decided upon. And then all new dwellings to comply with accessibility requirements under Part M2 of the building regs. That again has not found its way through the legislative process. But I thought highlighting some of the more wacky ones, or certainly some of the more scary ones, would be important just to show you what the mood music has been like when this has been going through the two houses that run our country. The very latest version, which I had the joy and delight of reading through in full earlier today to make sure this slide was accurate, includes, however, some reasonably scary stuff. Go through it. So there are some bits and pieces here that are pretty logical. Some further permitted development rights for highway authorities, for example, to install charging points for cars. We can understand that. An extension of planning permission and listed building consent if in the event there is a legal challenge. We can understand that. Natural England not being required to comment on everything they're asked to comment on, only focusing on the largest schemes. Can understand that. Natural England gaining compulsory purchase powers so that they can use the nature restoration levy to actually produce nature restoration improvements. We can understand that. The bits that scare the living bejesus out of me are as follows. Planning authorities to set their own planning charges up to cost recovery for planning applications. Right. That was suggested all the way back during the Tory years, and they looked at the numbers. If that comes to pass, a planning application for a single house, depending on the authority, could cost upwards of £10,000 if it's full cost recovery. That's how much it costs some of these authorities to determine the planning to process the planning application that costs you, the consumer, 588 quid. That one's expressly scary because that creates a very, very high barrier to entry. That's been coming for a while. And given the current mood of our present government, trying to get as much out of us beloved populace as they possibly can, I don't see that going away. They're proposing to change the general permitted development order in respect of demolition. At the moment, very strangely, you can apply for demolition consent for the demolition of an asset of community value. And that's dealt with through permitted development. They're proposing to change that provision and remove it so that assets of community value automatically require planning permission to demolish them. Now, some might say that that makes sense. It is a change to the permitted development rights and a removal. And when governments start to look at removals, it's a bit of a slippery slope for them to start looking at other stuff. So again, I showed you the previous slide where the Lords are currently at. I don't see that going away. And then finally, for planning authorities, the Secretary of State gains powers through the infrastructure bill to forcibly prepare a local plan where a planning authority habitually fails to do so. So some of our planning authorities out there that have been unable to develop their own local plan will have Steve's guns firmly fixed upon them, because when this becomes law, he will have powers imposed, powers granted by the Act to take command of that plan making process and do it forcibly. So I think that's quite scary. That's very much a centrist, bringing power back to the center approach, which is very much a hallmark of where this Labour government is at the moment. They're very much power in the centre rather than power in the communities, big government rather than little government. And that's very much a policy point where they're sticking on. I think that brings me to the end. No, not quite. There is a timeline for this, an implementation process. I put a funny little UR here. So the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act and its provisions included a timeline. We're at 25-26, and what we should be seeing is pathfinder authorities trialing new systems. We are seeing 7 authorities currently trialing the new appeal system, the new standard appeal system, moving away from the one provided by the Inspectorate and one provided on Gov UK. So that's starting to happen, and we've started to notice that occur. The idea is by 2027, you will see a full system-wide implementation of new local plans and systems, including the development management, national development management policies themselves. So we're on a route pathway to seeing this happen. In terms of the big scary bill, and its passage through Parliament, this is the current passage status. And good news if you want an early Christmas present, because it's at 3rd reading in the Lords. Now, 3rd reading in the Lords means that it's a very quick pathway from here. We're likely to see this bill become law by the time we're listening to the King's speech. And so, yeah, get ready, because happy Christmas, everyone. Big planning fees are coming down the road. I think that brings me to the end. It does. If there are any questions off the back of that, in the chat, please. I'm going to open the chat up, have a look at it myself. If any questions on the back of that in the chat, I'll be happy to answer them. Or are we all like, holy shit, let's just go and live in Spain? Italy is lovely. I can also recommend Morocco. Don't pet any of the cats, but I can recommend Morocco. Any questions? Craig says, yes, let's live in Italy. I wouldn't disagree. Now, any questions on the presentation? Right. Alex asks, what's causing the big planning fees? So for years and years and years, Alex, it's been the case that planning authorities have been subsidised by your council tax bills. That's because they will never bring in fees what it actually costs them to do the planning application in terms of officer time. It's typically about 40 hours or thereabouts a week for an officer to determine a planning application just in their time alone. If that application then has to go out to statutory consultees, that's additional costs. If it has to get publicised in the newspaper, the council pays for that. If it has to go to appeal, that comes from your planning fee as well. And if it goes to committee, that committee time comes from the planning fee. So £588 is spread awfully thin when you consider all of that. The government's moving to full cost recovery. Building regs is run near as makes no odds on full cost recovery, albeit it's a much simpler system. Planning is much more complex. So what causes the big planning fees is the complexity in the system and so many different layers that work on it. Alice asks, how much is the average planning application for one house? So the research was done many years ago, back in 2008, which is when I was still a town planner at council. That's how long ago it was. And they suggested that the average sat at about £7,500. That's between the highs, about 10,000, and the lows, about £5,000. Now, obviously, that's planning authority dependent. So a planning authority up in the north, let's call it Durham, might have very different costs associated with it to a planning authority in the south, let's call it Westminster, right? Everything is different because there's not one marketplace for this, there's multiple marketplaces for this. That's how much it is. Thoughts on still in section 106, will these remain separate or be bundled into these planning fees? Great question. They are going to remain separate, at least for now. There's no proposition in place to change community infrastructure levy. The previous Tory government legislated for it, and this Labour government have said, no, we are not doing that. That's a bad idea. So that's not changing. Neither is the section 106 system. Labour have put the brakes on all of that. What they're doing instead is the nature restoration levy, which is that separate community infrastructure levy, for want of a better term, that provides for direct nature restoration improvement. What is a good strategy right now? Commercial to resi? Question mark. Great question. I think in reality it is a whole bundle of strategies. We're in a weird period at the moment where everyone is very uncertain. The whole system is very uncertain right now, and we're still seeing very high land price and comparatively stagnant house price. I think you have to just tailor the strategy for the particular area that you're working in, and some strategies just won't work in a certain area. For example, I was giving advice on a site in County Durham very recently where nothing would work. You can't build, you can't convert, because you can buy a house for 60 grand, and that was actually the price of the houses directly opposite the site. So forget the site, because nothing's ever going to go on there because you simply cannot make it work. John asks, thanks for that. You gave an example of planning costs of circa 10 grand for a single unit. Firstly, will household costs on extensions also be rising? Yes, it's a broadband increase. Secondly, what would, and I realise how long's a piece of string, a commercial conversion of 10 houses be, for example? Did they not take into account the developers are creating new council tax payers and new units? That's a great question, John. It is a broadband increase. It allows a council to set its own fees across the fee schedule. And so household costs would be increasing. I don't know how much by, because all we know at this stage is what the research in 2008 said for a single house unit. And absolutely a commercial conversion would be rising as well. The government raised the fees on commercial conversion, doubled them last year anyway, and significantly increased the cost of householder. I don't see that going down. I can only see that going up. Yes, they're creating new council taxpayers, but in reality, it's all about the quick win right now. Craig says, the worry I have a councillor and a committee with planning experience is speculative planning or big scale, i.e. 60, that is not in the proposed plan, basically exploiting an authority not having a demonstrable 5-year. A worry I have as councillor and committee, but with planning experience is speculative planning. Okay, I get where you're going. It is a worry, Craig. It is absolutely a worry. Now, some might say that, certainly the private sector would say that planning authorities need to get their act together. You need to have a demonstrable 5-year housing land supply and use the standard method in order to get there. If you can't get that, use the duty to cooperate, play nicely with your adjoining authorities. I think it's a case of everyone has to pull their fair share. I'm hoping that the committee getting trained up will help them make better planning decisions and less knee-jerk decisions. But it remains to be seen how effective these reforms are. Remember, of course, that we're on our lowest ever housing delivery since the 60s. This year is the worst on record, and that's not my words, that's the Office of National Statistics reporting on that. Alex asks, do councils have a requirement to consult the public on local plans design code? My council Spelthorne were pretty representative on a method of design code, but I think had better outcomes than old homeowner councillors deciding. Because the design code will be part of the local plan, there will be the duty to consult and there will be the examination in public. It will go through the local plan process in exactly the same way and will be subject to recommendations by the planning inspectorate in exactly the normal way. The design code becomes part of the local plan and so is given that full assessment in public at that stage. Is there going to be an increased duty on planning officers to communicate with the affected communities if the planning committees are to be emasculated? We don't see that right now. So the bill doesn't make provision for it, but secondary legislation like a new development management procedures order will definitely come through. And so the reality is I'm pretty sure that the requirement for planning officers to communicate fully, again, through digital planning, it should all be open and transparent, will be enhanced. Craig says, we're rural here in Lancs and its amenities we lack. I completely agree with you. I know Lancashire very well, and it's a very rural area outside of the major cities and conurbation. So the local amenities, having those local amenities built is really, really important. I think what this government needs to get its head around is that that is not a quick win. That is not an instant thing that has to come as part of wider measures, but developers need to pay their fair share too. And that's why the golden rules are in place to ensure that on those bigger schemes above the major limit, developers do pay their fair share. I'm not going to say developers should be immune from that. I think they should contribute. That's my view as a planner. On a positive note, this is from James. Positive note, rural nutrient neutrality won't be balloted moving forward, a small win. Yes, it will just move into that nature restoration fund. So you will still pay for it, James, but it won't hold things up. So you'll just pay the charge instead as part of development charging. Craig says, you also mentioned local government reform in Lancs, which is huge. How will the proposed local plans be carried over to the new authorities? Great question. So whilst the new authorities are shadow authorities, the old local plans will still be enforced. We know this because we've seen it in Buckinghamshire. in Bucks, they are still operating on their 4 segregated local plans. Milton Keynes chose not to be part of Buckinghamshire. They chose to be their own thing. And so Milton Keynes has its own local plan as well. But in Bucks, they're still operating on the 4 local plans. They're slowly moving towards a new combined local plan. But the original local plans, the individual ones, will stay in force whilst the new one, the big one, is being created. We'll have the same problem in Surrey and any of the authorities that are moving to a combined system. Dorset has just completed that process. So is Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, which is the other part of Dorset. They've moved to a BCP plan. And that's how it's going to evolve. So, Andre, we're going to do a couple more questions, guys, and then I think we'll leave it for the night. So thank you so much if you've given us questions, and thank you so much for coming online. I have recorded this, so you will be able to watch it back, and it will get posted to my YouTube channel. So you can find that by searching my name. Is the housing supply an objective number? I had a single unit refused. The LA housing supply is 4 years. They said it wasn't far off having a 5-year supply. They would not be giving any weighting to it. I thought it was the case having 5-year supply or not. Had some weighting, and that must be applied if there isn't a 5-year housing land supply. Right. It is still for the decision maker at local authority level at the moment to apply appropriate weight. Not having a 5-year housing land supply, i.e. 0.1% under, is not having a 5-year housing land supply. There is no variation on the theme there. When that goes to the inspector, it will be for the inspector to apply weight. It's still a weighted exercise. Now, it is often the case that most authorities say, well, 1 isn't enough. We want more, because the bigger schemes are the ones that carry the biggest punch, and that's might be what they're playing there. Or often difficult to deal with individual cases. Craig asks, any mention of new towns in the bill? No, absolutely none. To be fair, the bill is silent on new towns. Suffice it to say, I have to come as part of the New Towns Act, which would be a whole separate bill. And they're not really new towns at all. They're proposing 12 of them, but most of them are urban extensions. I think only 4 are actually new towns, new settlements. 2 more questions, or 1 more question. Yeah, 2 more questions, then I think we're done. With Surrey, it'll be interesting to know if they can follow the same system as another unitary, Somerset, which have a planning committee for each of the former district areas it replaces. Somerset's a good example. North Yorkshire is, I think, a standard bearer for how to do this. North Yorkshire kept its local offices, it kept its local committees, and it kept its local planning officers in local offices. It's North York Council, but if you're doing development in Scarborough, you go to the Scarborough Planning Committee and you speak to Scarborough planning officers. So I think if they're going to follow the standard bearer, Somerset is okay. North Yorkshire is actually very, very good, having worked with them very recently. You mentioned changes in demolition rights for community assets. Will local councils hide behind this and list even more buildings as locally listed community assets to stop development? It seems like the big thing in the Midlands, following demolition of local pub. Councils can't designate them. They're designated by communities. So it has to be members of the public that designate. Will they hide behind it? I don't know. It's a great question. It remains to be seen how they behave. I think that brings us to the end, everyone. I can only say thank you so much. If you've got any questions or anything you want us to do on a planning application, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Contact details are there, help@tpexpert.org, or the phone number 02392 523352. We do deal with that variety of planning work across the country. And certainly as long as it's in England. I've been recently asked to deal with Scotland, and I've had to turn that around and say, okay, the no. So thank you very much. I hope that was enjoyable for everyone. We have been recording. It will be shared on the YouTube channel later this evening. But thank you very much for joining.